So these are some gluten and grain-free foods rich in vitamin B12. Now I didn't list on here, I didn't list dairy, but we could list dairy on here. Because dairy does contain, so if you're trying to, again, eat more plant-based, if you're going to use dairy, I said this before, but the problem with a lot of dairy today is A1 casein. A1 casein can mimic gluten. So a lot of the dairy products out there can create gluten-like problems. If you're getting A2 casein or A2 milk, then the biggest thing you got to want to watch out for is make sure it's organic and that it's hormone-free. One of the problems, again, with dairy in general, aside from the mimicking, is what is added to the dairy. A lot of the processed dairy today, you've got other gums and other additives, things like tissue transglutaminase, but microbial transglutaminase or meat glue, which is added oftentimes to dairy. So dairy can be problematic, and we have to understand that many people are allergic to dairy. And if they're not allergic to dairy, with gluten sensitivity, one of the side effects of gluten sensitivity is something called lactose intolerance. It's not the same thing as dairy allergy. Intolerance means you lack the enzymes that digest lactose, which is the sugar found in dairy. And when you can't break that down, it causes a lot of gas and intestinal bloating and makes life very, very painful when you're eating dairy. So lactose intolerance is a side effect oftentimes of gluten-induced damage, because gluten damages the intestinal cells. Those cells produce lactase, the enzyme that helps you break down lactose. And so many people that have gluten issues over time, they start to develop dairy issues because of the intolerance. So again, you got to be cautious with dairy, although yes, it does contain B12, but these are your other sources. You could add, again, I mentioned shiitake mushroom earlier, you could add that too, but it's not a great source. It's a poor source of vitamin B12. So I wouldn't suggest anyone just try to get all of their B12 from that food source by itself. Let's talk about some lab testing next. So there's a lot of debate in this area, and so we're just going to talk about some different things, some more basic that any doctor can run, and some a little bit more complex. We're missing something here. So MCV and MCH. So MCV, MCH tests, this stands for mean corpuscular volume and mean corpuscular hemoglobin, but a lot of times these tests will come back and they'll be too high. So your markers on your blood test, this is a basic blood test that any doctor can run on what's called a CBC, a complete blood count. So if they're running a complete blood count test, these are two values that come back. Oftentimes with B12 deficiency, these markers will come back high. And remember what this means. So I showed you earlier that, let's change colors. I showed you earlier that, that when the red blood cells are born, they're born very large. Right, we called that megaloblastic anemia. So they're born very large, and they have to mature and get smaller, and then eventually they form kind of that biconcave disc that looks like a red blood cell. Well, an MCV, MCH value means your cells are too big, mean corpuscular volume. So it's the volume inside the corpuscle. Corpuscle is a red blood cell, so that's the fancy language over here. That's the kind of the translation, if you will. But if you've got large, then you're going to have high MCV, MCH. So this can mean that you have a B12 deficiency. But I want to be cautious, because you might have done this and you have an elevation in your MCV, and you've taken B12 and your MCV stays elevated even though you've taken B12 for a long time. B12 deficiency is not the only thing that can cause elevation in MCV and MCH. So these tests, although can be helpful, aren't definitive. So you can't rely on them all by themselves. And that's important, because if you're asking your doctor to check your B12, you don't want to just look at these tests. Now there's also a test called a homocysteine test. And I mentioned this one a minute ago. Homocysteine is a natural byproduct of cell metabolism. So our cells naturally produce homocysteine. And one of the things that happens is homocysteine is converted into a substance called methionine. And so what happens to make methionine from homocysteine requires B12. And so if you don't have adequate B12, you cannot convert homocysteine into methionine, and so homocysteine will elevate. So this is another one. High levels of homocysteine, generally, on a lab test, it's something higher than 9. If it's above 9, that's generally too high. Sometimes I get people in their 30s, which is quite high, but homocysteine elevation can be a sign, a lab marker, if you will, of the potential for a B12 deficiency. But just like MCV elevations can also be B12, but can be other things, so too can homocysteine. So homocysteine being elevated is not explicitly caused by a B12 deficiency, although again, it can cause it, it's not always exact. Another test is called an MMA test or methylmalonic acid test. This test can be high, would also indicate a vitamin B12 deficiency. So these are two that most of your doctors know about or should know about. I would hope they would know about them. They're pretty common. And so these are things you can ask for that generally insurance covers. So if you're going in and your doctor he's not an expert or she's not an expert in nutrition, and you're just kind of like trying to put some things together, you can ask for these tests. Although my advice is if your doctor doesn't know anything about nutrition, you shouldn't be going to that doctor to try to figure nutrition out. Like, you don't want to be the guinea pig for their lack of experience. But at the same time, I want to give you this information so that you have the ability to ask about it. Now, some people and some doctors will measure something called a serum B12. And a serum B12 test is really, in my opinion, is a very poor way to assess. It's very poor to try to assess B12. And one of the reasons why, there's a process in the body called redistribution. So remember when I said earlier that your liver stores about 1.5 to 2 years of extra B12, rainy day B12, if you will. And so what happens is when the serum levels drop, the liver pushes out B12 into the bloodstream. This is called redistribution. The liver registers that low B12 in the serum. It pushes B12 into the serum. If I'm a doctor measuring your serum levels, I might be catching that your levels look normal because your liver is pumping extra B12 out into the bloodstream. And if I'm running your lab test as that's happening, we're going to get a false normal. We're going to get a serum lab test that is not all that accurate. So you got to be very cautious about serum B12. Now, if your serum B12 is low, you definitely do have a problem. So you say, this test is okay if it comes back low, but if it comes back normal, it doesn't mean you don't have a vitamin B12 deficiency. So it's very important that you understand that. And the best way, in my opinion, the best way to come and look at B12 is something called intracellular testing. It's where you actually look inside the cell with a stimulator. So there's a technology that we use in clinic where we'll actually radio label your DNA inside your cells with something called thymidine and measure the growth rate of the cell. And when we do that, we can then challenge the cell with or without nutrients to see what nutrients it's storing adequate quantities of. That is the best way to analyze a vitamin B12 deficiency. So very, very important. So that you're not relying on that serum. Now let's check out some of the different forms. I know that's going to be some of the questions that we get tonight. There's different forms of B12. There's cobalamin, which is what B12 is. But then there are certain things that are attached to cobalamin or B12. Okay, and one of them is cyano. So if you ever see the term cyanocobalamin, that's a form of B12. It's poorly absorbed. And it's poorly bioavailable. So once you do absorb it, your body has to convert it into adenosylcobalamin and other forms of cobalamin B12. And so if you're deficient in other nutrients, this process of conversion doesn't happen very well. So cyano is kind of on the low list. It's a poor, I don't recommend it. It's poorly absorbed and it's just not a great form. The reason why you're going to see this in so many supplements will contain the cyanocobalamin is because it's super cheap. And so a lot of your supplement manufacturers they're going to lean into the fact that most of you are probably ignorant about the differences of B12. Now, not all of you are. I know some of you are really smart, but a lot of you don't know these differences. That's why I'm teaching them. And if you never heard of this before, and now you start looking at supplements, if that supplement contains cyanocobalamin, you know what you're doing is you're buying a product that's really cheap, it's poorly absorbable, and it's not going to work very well to correct a deficiency. I see this happen a lot with the injections. A lot of doctors will use cyanocobalamin as an injectable of B12, and they're using the worst form, and they don't get great correction with those poorly bioavailable forms. So cyanocobalamin is not great. You also have another form called adenosine, which is better than cyanocobalamin. And then you have hydroxy, which is what the body is natural form. The natural form found in the body is hydroxy. And then you have the activated form, which is methylcobalamin. So these are the two I prefer, hands down. And why would we differ between hydroxy or methylcobalamin? For some people, methylcobalamin can cause anxiety. It's too strong. It's too bioavailable. It's too bioactive. It's going to become almost like a stimulant. It can cause irritation, agitation, irritability, and keep them awake at night. So if that's you, if you've ever taken B12 and it was methylcobalamin, you're probably going to do better on a hydroxycobalamin. It's a lot better tolerated by people that have B vitamin sensitivities. So hydroxy is a good brand, or a good, not brand, but a good form of B12, but generally inside the body it has to be converted into methylcobalamin. And so by taking it in this form, you just allow that to happen in your body, kind of a little bit slower of a process, so you don't tend to get ramped up or amped up. And so again, those of you, I saw the question I think a couple of times in the feed, why do I have agitation or irritability when I take vitamin B12 in the methylcobalamin form? This could be the potential reason why. So how much do you take when it comes to B12? It depends. I mean, if you're very deficient, if you're severely deficient, what we use in the practice is anything between 2,000 and 10,000 micrograms daily. That's a C. Micrograms daily, 2 to 10,000 micrograms daily, and it just depends on the individual. I mean, just know this, B12 is very safe. There's no known potential toxic doses. No one has ever died of B12 overdose, and so you're not going to most likely hurt yourself, although I wouldn't suggest you just randomly take 10,000 indefinitely without having some of these labs properly done where you can get a good idea for what's going on. But again, these are ranges that we'll commonly use with people to get good correction. The other thing to consider here is that some vitamins, aside from their forms, B12 is absorbed, as I showed you, in the stomach and the small intestine. Those two areas are very important. Those two areas are also commonly damaged by gluten. So if you're there, if you've just gone gluten-free and these areas are damaged and you're trying to take like a B complex vitamin that has, these forms of B12, you're probably not going to absorb it as well. That's one of the hallmarks of swallowing the pill if you're damaged. So one of the great things about B12 is you can do a sublingual. And what a sublingual will do is it will bypass your stomach and your intestine, and it will absorb through the mucosal tissue in your cheeks, through your buccal mucosa. So a sublingual, one of those lozenges that you just put in the mouth and let it dissolve, is going to absorb through your cheeks and bypass the damage of your stomach and small intestine. So this may be a better consideration if you're new to the gluten-free diet and you suspect that you've got a lot of years of damage in your stomach and small intestines where you might not be properly absorbing. It's just a more efficient way to get it absorbed. Okay. All right, well, lastly, what I want to talk to you about tonight, a lot of you have lost your taste and smell. And so let's move some of this stuff out of the way. There's a lot of research going on right now in this industry. And one of the studies I showed you earlier was that vitamin B12 deficiency could affect olfactory nerve function. So it could create a loss of taste and smell. There's a lot of people right now, with the disease that shall not be named, getting olfactory loss. In other words, their taste is very dramatically changed. They can't smell, they can't taste post-infection. We know that B12 can affect olfactory. So I wanted to show you some of the things that are being researched right now. These are new studies, they're newer studies. So you can see in this study, can vitamin B12 be an adjuvant to disease that shall not be named treatment? Okay, so we've got, in this particular study, what they're claiming or what they're saying is that it's possible to infer that this virus interferes with cobalamin metabolism or vitamin B12 metabolism. And the reason why is it causes a lot of oxidative stress and damage that can elevate homocysteine concentration, that can lead to problems with platelets, elevated chemicals in the blood that can pull or have an impact on vitamin B12. So the theory is that the symptoms or the problems associated with the illness can actually deplete your B12 and leave you wanting for B12. Okay, now, so that's one study here where these doctors are hypothesizing that B12 may be a key element that might be helpful for some individuals. Now, in this study, and this was just recently published as well, what you're seeing here is, we've talked about cytokine storms in the past, the viral binding and invasion and adaptive immunity. This is what we all want right here. This is what everyone's after, is the ability to be able to produce healthy levels of antibodies, right? You got T cells and you got B cells. The B cells produce the antibodies. That's what these little things right here are. Those are antibodies that help bind onto viruses and prevent them from basically taking over. And one of the things that's necessary for these functions to work are your B cells. You also, though, or rather your B12 is necessary for your B cells to perform as well as your T cells. So B12 is also necessary for your T cells, which are natural killer cells. NKC, these natural killer cells can help you kill off bad guys. So again, these authors of this paper are theorizing, and they're not just stopping at B12, but they're talking about B1 up here with adaptive immunity. They're talking about B2 with viral replication, and B3, as well as the cytokine storm with B5 and B6, and hypercoagulability means clotting of the blood with B6 and B12. So you can see it's the family of B vitamins that they're basically saying these guys play a major role in host immune defense, how your body responds and adapts to the exposure. So these are all very important. Now let's say you get sick and you were deficient in these B vitamins before you got sick. That is one reason people get sick, is they have poor levels of nutrient status. In other words, their nutrient levels are low, they're poor, and then they're subjected to exposures, and their body can't handle it because all these very important functions need these key B vitamins in order to do those functions. So again, I'm just trying to illustrate that for you, because this last one here, and this isn't the only study, but I just want to show you this because, again, I know a lot of you are looking for what you can do to be as preventative as possible. So here's what they found, that vitamin D, DMB, DMB stands for vitamin D, magnesium, and B12. So vitamin D and B combination in older COVID-19 patients was associated with a significant reduction in proportion of patients with clinical deterioration requiring oxygen support and/or intensive care support. In other words, the combination of D, magnesium, and B12 led to better outcomes in these individuals. And I think it's important that you all have this knowledge so that you can make those decisions intelligently about what it is that you want to do, whether that's supplementation or making sure your diet is dialed in, super tight so that you're getting adequate B12. But where I see a lot of people being affected right now is especially the ones that are low protein diets and animal or no animal meat, so purely vegan. I see a lot of vegans kind of teetering. Their immune systems are teetering on the brink. And so the ones, as I should say, particularly the ones that aren't supplementing. And so again, I just want to encourage any of you listening that if you're doing that, you get supplementation in adequately so that you give your body what it needs to help defend you.
Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.